Okay.
Okay. I think, I mean, even if it
Yes, yes. No,
yeah,
but
there's no point in waiting.
now,
So,
now take use check.
yeah. So, in the philosophical implications, Wittgenstein comes up with this one problem when it comes to, when we say that we are following rules when we are learning language or meaning. So, this particular problems he discusses from philosophical investigations section 143 till 242. Here I would like to quote, without these rules the word has yet no meaning, and if we change the rules it now has another meaning, and in that case we may just as well change the word too. So here he is emphasizing the importance of rules. Okay. Now next, this is where he gives this particular problem. Sorry. So in PI 201 he says there is a paradox when we talk about rule following. And what is this paradox? He says no course of action could be determined by a rule, because every course of action can be made out to accord with the rule. The answer was, if everything can be made out to accord with the rule, then it can also be made out to conflict with it. And so there would be neither accord nor conflict here. So what this means is that there can be many rules that can be, when we talk about a certain expression or certain content of thought, there can be many rules that can differentiate this, right? That can discuss or that can explain it. Now, what was the implication of this paradox? This paradox was, this paradox gave us this particular paradox or question, like, then when we say that we are following rules, how do we know that we are doing it correctly? So there the debate starts. So some scholars say that this particular approach of understanding rules or norms, standards of correctness, can be explained in terms of natural facts, like our physiological behaviors, or in other words, dispositions. This is also called as gerrymandering objection, but still then it fails to account for how something can be done as correct or incorrect. Now, Wittgenstein is also against this particular idea of reducing the rule, reducing normativity or norms, understanding how something is right or wrong, to something implicit, or to something reducing in a reductionist way, or even to say from an evolutionary or scientific kind of way, reducing it. Wittgenstein is against it. Again, another objection that Wittgenstein says is that we cannot, so some thinkers like Plato reduces such kind of understanding rule following, says that we have to go beyond linguistic rules, some sort of a metaphysical kind of rules that are there again. So, but Wittgenstein is also against this particular idea. So the next approach is from anti-reductionism, which basically is explicit in their approach. So this approach accepts that there are norms of language, but when we accept that, there is another objection that comes, which is called the infinite regress problem. Because when we say that there are rules to explain how those rule following is supposed to be done, then we can always talk about another rule to support that rule, and another rule can come, another rule can come, so we can go on to ad infinitum. So that is one, two objections that we see with the paradox of Wittgenstein in PI. So, like, yeah. So basically the main idea is that to follow a rule, to say that we are following a rule, first we need to understand that particular rule, the rule of following. So that is the main debate of that. Now, Wittgenstein, he gives some particular solution. So as I said before, many scholarships is there on Wittgenstein, so different kind of interpretations are there. Now, but he gives a solution saying that this can be resolved when we take rule as a form of life, that it is embedded in our practice. So it's a kind of a social nature understanding, a convention, customs, practices, all these words we will use, language games. So this is, so when we are learning rules, it gets embedded in it, right? And living in a linguistic community, through training and practices, we start to understand this kind of rules. Now, till that much is okay, but still the question remains. I mean, how do we know that we are following a rule correctly or incorrectly? That question still remains. Now, Wittgenstein seems to say that finally we keep on going to another rule to explain another rule, but finally we come to an end, a bedrock. And finally he says, at some point, explanations of how we are following a rule must come to an end. And that is the bedrock, where our back is turned and where we cannot go any further justification. Now, this particular conclusion of Wittgenstein also is taken by many as not saying anything at all, taking a quietist approach. So basically, it is not really answering the question that we are trying to look for here. So here he says communal agreement in judgment is so there are many scholars who would take Wittgenstein taking a very quietist approach, not saying anything about it, that it is just there. The process of how we know that we are following a rule, it just comes, something like not really in natural in the natural sense, but it is something there. So how it is there, why it is there, he does not explain. He just says that it is the bedrock, and that's it, right? So here the last quotation will come important in my conclusion. Here in Wittgenstein's, some work of Wittgenstein's, like remarks on foundation of mathematics, Zettel, and in the PI also, we find he says communal agreement in judgments is a framework condition. Unless we could agree on how to apply a rule, we could not engage in that practice. So the understanding of how to follow that particular rule has to be done first, and then the expression of the engagement of that expression comes. Now, so basically Wittgenstein is taken as a quietist, but in my debate I would say that Wittgenstein also, though not necessarily in a very explicit way says it, he also follows some sort of a combination between implicit and explicit, that rule following can be explicitly learned also, rule following can be implicitly learned also. But what is the problem in saying that rule following is implicit is it kind of gets reduced to reductionism. That is the problem with it. And for the anti-reductionism, of course, we still have the infinite regress problem. But that infinite regress problem, Wittgenstein says, that can be resolved when we take rule following as a form of life in the community. Robert Brandom is another philosopher that is causing so much of confusion in the philosophical circles. I was told that there are now scholarships on how to read Brandom, like how to read Hegel.
Yeah.
So,
in fact, he's one of the few philosophers who is taken seriously in the analytic tradition and who has written on Hegel. I mean, I don't know of anybody apart from Brandon.
So I remember Dr. Kashyap and us during our PhD coursework, we did a course on Hegel phenomenology of spirit. That was the worst course I had. But Brandom has given this very interesting take on resolving this particular debate. So in his book, Making It Explicit, Reasoning, Representing, and Discursive Commitment, he wants to argue that norms are, so he wants to take a neutral stand. He says that it is both implicit and explicit can be combined together. So he says norms are implicit in practices, that is like Wittgenstein itself. Now the new thing that he does is he says that we have to take into context the importance of normative vocabulary. So this is something new that Brandom is trying to resolve. What are these normative vocabulary? These are like correct, incorrect, ought, must. So what Brandom is going to suggest is that such kind of normative vocabulary comes even before language exists. So how does it come? That is what Brandom will try to express. So his solution is this. So he talks about practical deontic attitudes. This is when we are living in a linguistic community or in a society, we have this practical deontic attitudes. What it means is that even before language comes, we have this attitude, deontic attitude. He calls it deontic scorekeeping. What it means is that imagine that imagine they are in proto-hominids time. Let us imagine there are 3 persons in a society who knows how to pick berries. So in that particular society, language has not existed in its present refined form, is not there as such. Now those 3 persons can pick berries, and out of those 3, one of them knows when the berry is sweetest. So the berries that he picks is often sweet. So now even without language, when they bring the berries, based on our experiences living in that particular society, we know that the 3rd person, his berries are always the sweet, so we want to go and take berries from here. That is the scorekeeping that we keep, that his action is like giving more kind of sense. So this is it. And finally, he would argue that, like Wittgenstein, he would say that, okay, this is how it is done first. So this is something that is implicit in us. We have this deontic scorekeeping attitude in us, something implicit in us. Now, of course, Brandom is also criticized, saying that, but is this not also reducing yourself to some sort of naturalism, saying that something is there in you inside? But so I would not go into that particular debate, but that is also seems to be a justified criticism. Now, we have this deontic attitude, and slowly as we are living in that community, language develops, and through our social practices, we learn how to take our actions as right or wrong. So this is something based on shared understanding. So his main contribution to the debate is that there is some sort of inferentialism where we make there's some sort of inferentialism where we have this idea of normativity first, normative vocabulary, and as we start to make such kind of normative vocabulary or start to make expressions with involvement, enculturation in the linguistic community, that this particular infinite regress problem can be resolved. How? Because you have rule that one knows whether a particular rule is being followed correctly or incorrectly. The society or the linguistic community gives that particular verdict. But the problem here lies with this particular gerrymandering objection. Gerrymandering is the idea that any set of behaviors can fit multiple interpretations of a rule. So how do we do that? This is the gerrymandering objection, and Brandon's solution is to take normative vocabulary as irreducible. As I said, concepts like correct, incorrect, must, ought, should, all these things are present even before language comes. So, and that is how he tries to avoid the objection. And yeah. So shared practices, training and mastery, just like Wittgenstein. The contribution of Brandom is that through we can avoid this gerrymandering objection by taking by adopting a normative vocabulary which is there before even language came about. Now, so as I said, the solution of Brandom also seems to, I mean, like you also reducing yourself to naturalism. Brandom is criticized by quite a few philosophers. But can we understand Brandom as not reducing it in a very reductionist way to naturalism, but he's trying to make a neutral stand. And this particular idea of to support this idea of Brandom, I looked into the evolutionary theory of the emergence of language. We have so many philosophers who have talked about emergence of language, saying that usually majority of them says that language came first and then culture came, society came. But this is one evolutionary theorist who argues that culture came first, and through culture, language developed. Now, this particular idea, I think that we can make a comparative idea with Brandom, and seems to be agreeing with Brandom and Donald both. So, it's a culture first theory, Donald says. His theory is called theory of mimesis. So, first he talks about mimicry, how language gets developed, how language gets emergence of language. There's this concept of mimicry, reduplication, deliberate reduplication in action of a perceived event without careful attention to knowledge. So an example would be a child mimicking an adult speech in an unreflective way. At that particular point of time, a child really does not know whether he is or she is applying to that particular norm. Next comes the imitation part. It is flexible. A child imitating adult behavior while playing dolls. Then finally mimesis, which is reduplication of an event for communicative purposes. So mimesis requires the audience to be taken into account. It also demands taking a third-person perspective on the actor's own behavior. So this is just a kind of a continuum of how language is learned. So from basic reactions and gestures or inference, a child learns how to learn language. So these things are, and as we learn, now we are refined language speakers, but it does not mean that we have forgotten or we have, we have left those kind of reactions or gestures. It is still there with us. And that is how we learn new language every day, or new gestures. So Donald's theory of emergence of language also seems to support that some sort of culture was there first, like some sort of proto-humanite culture, like that Brandom was also talking about. And then with that, but he, of course, since he's an evolutionary biologist, this is just his explanation, but Brandom's explanation makes it clear in the sense that this concept, when we were there in this proto-hominid society, the idea of inference, to know that something is correct or wrong, that we have to do something, we ought to do something, those idea is already there. And to learn a refined language as we go into society, through shared practices, those refined comes. And I also, in support of that, I also take Wittgenstein as not taking a quietist approach, but Wittgenstein also, I would argue that, agrees to what Merlin Donald and Brandom says. Because when we look into some of his works, as I was saying, these are some of the cherry pickings that I did. So from Wittgenstein's work, you can see that Wittgenstein also talks about primitive language. Some sort of primitive language has been there first. So here, the origin, in the third one, in culture and value, he says this: the origin and the primitive form of the language game is a reaction. So, not only from this can more complicated forms developed. Language, I want to say, is refinement. In the beginning was the deed. So before this particular, so Wittgenstein also is trying to say that, through this passage, is trying to say that this sort of primitive language must have been there. Now, in order for some primitive language also to exist, there must exist, for example, a sort of understanding that when we do this particular action, it is wrong. When we do this particular action, it is right. Only then we can start applying the rule. And how to know we are following correctly or correctly, the social practices will tell us the rule. So that is why this is what I was trying to talk about.
More,
I was able to.
more, encore.
So it's, as I said, it's just a kind of a work in progress. I know there are so many loopholes into it, so maybe during discussion we can have some feedbacks.
Thank you, that was fascinating. Anybody has any questions or clarifications? If you would like to clarify certain things, go ahead.
Yes, my question is related to priority of deontic attitudes. So I cannot understand a non-naturalistic reading of deontic attitudes. The point is, it appears to me that it makes normativity too easy to attain. For example, if there is a religious community and people attach a meaning to which, the idea of which, so they can always harken back to the idea of deontic attitudes. So within this framework, how do we get out of this problem? That not too easily to harken back to deontic attitudes and attain a better standard of normativity.
Yes, so thank you for the question. This is, as I was saying, this is one problem that Brandon also is that for me, he tries to take a normal, kind of a neutral way between this particular idea of whether it can be implicit, whether it can be reduced or whether it used or whether it can be not reduced. So I think in a way he gives some sort of a new reading or a new interpretation of understanding it. Yes. So, but there is one criticism, yes, that always comes with Brandon. Because, yeah.
Okay, and why do we need to have a unique meaning fact? So the multiplicity of meaning facts can be a virtue of a linguistic community. For example, if we borrow an analogy from philosophy of science, in theory choice you have multiple virtues: simplicity, consistency, and you can allocate different weighing schemes to it. And it's a virtue of the scientific community that why is it a problem? Because I don't think the argument from multiplicity of meaning facts slips to relativism of meaning facts. So
Yes. No. The problem comes when, so the problem should be addressed this way. In order to be a rule follower, we need to know the rule first, right? So how is that we're able to know that particular rule? And how is that if we say that there's another rule to understand it, and as I said, it goes to infinite regress. But the other thing is, if we say that through our behavior, through our disposition, we can say that, then the gerrymandering objection comes. So yes, we can have multiplicity of meanings in our language and all. Yes, I agree that is yes.
So, I had some trouble understanding the gerrymandering objection, and maybe this is connected to the other question I had. Is that, I mean, it's the same question really. What's wrong with being reductionist here? So, I mean, if by a naturalistic explanation we can resolve the dilemma, a real problem when it can be resolved, or is there another impetus to it? Like, I don't understand the gerrymandering objection that is raised to the, the naturalistic explanation or the solution to this.
For this way, if we talk about the concept, meaning of understanding an expression through our behavior, or through our dispositions, then there can be many, so our behavior can change, our dispositions can change. There can be many interpretations of that. So we cannot have, so for example, now I might be, if you just look at my behavior or my disposition, I might be saying something else. Other days I might be saying another thing. So that is where the problem comes.
So we just choose the dominant mood. So we just choose the dominant mood.
Dominant
that
behavior.
That interpretation which prevails.
So for example, let us say, let us talk about some behaviors. Right? No. No, this does not really resolve the paradox. In the sense, for example, we talk about dominant behaviors, but how to judge that particular dominant behavior? Right? Now that particular, if we look at meaning only from our dispositions or our behavior, it becomes very difficult. Now we are picking and choosing certain behaviors which corresponds. Majority of people are doing it. Let us follow it, right? And in another cases, that particular disposition might change. No?
So for example, let's say we have.
Ronak, I think you're presupposing that meaning is not normative.
That again, there are two schools in linguistics as well.
Yeah.
One would say that there is a prescriptivist thing,
So what
and
do you
one word should mean something,
Yeah.
and then there is other prescriptivist. The word means whatever most
So
people.
the idea is that I think implicit. The idea is that meaning is inherently normative. I think
Yes, yes. So for example, when we say meaning is in
So sir, couldn't this debate be reduced to the question why must I even follow, or why must I even follow the norm? Why must I essentially we are trying to solve a problem that is normative by digging at what lies under the normativity. But that's the thing about normativity. There is no objective resolution to it. It's like asking why must I be a good person,
yes, yes.
right?
So yes. So but that is what I'm saying. That the debate says that gets reduced to naturalism, as you are saying. And Wittgenstein also says that is the bedrock. I mean, now justification stops. Why do we want to go further and further? At one point we have to stop the justification. So that is the bedrock. But in this particular debate, I'm trying to highlight that is not satisfactory. Can we go and look at it from a different interpretation again? Otherwise, yes, many scholarships also agree with what you are saying. I agree with that. Yes, for sure. But when we agree to this particular point that you are saying, the criticism is that why should we reduce it to some sort of naturalism or something like that? That criticism comes.
Also, sir, I have another inquiry which is broader for philosophy as such. There are people who look at philosophy from an evolutionary perspective. I'm so glad this came up because thought experiments like, okay, what about pre-modern society where one does not have express vocal language, but there are shared understandings and shared meanings as such. Such debates are also taking place in fields like neurology or evolutionary neurology, evolutionary psychology.
Okay.
And scholars like popular science communicators like Steven Pinker also speak a lot about this. In fact, his hypothesis is the root of all human evolution lies in the development of language. So how far do these discussions in philosophy, let's say, incorporate arguments from these other fields? Because they also lead to certain insights. So for example, one allegory, not an allegory, I mean it was a thought experiment but which could very well reflect our reality as and a creature that evolved was your example of how the culture emerged first. There were some shared meanings, and when those shared meanings began, a more refined stage of language appeared. Wouldn't it be beneficial if philosophers also dug into insights that can be very beneficially borrowed from fields like evolutionary biology when it comes to this?
Yeah, sure. So, but when it comes to this particular debate, the one caution is that when you take an evolutionary perspective, then usually the scholar says that you are reducing it. Why reduce? Why take this naturalized kind of procedure? Evolutionary biology is usually considered some sort of a reducing it to naturalism.
Sir, isn't that
Yes.
gerrymandering the solution? isn't that like gerrymandering the solution?
Yes, that is what the criticism comes with random as well. No?
So it's like we're sustaining the problem because we are fond of the problem more than.
No, it's more like when we talk about notions of correctness, that itself is a normal thing.
Yeah,
Is not that. So suppose you give a evolutionary argument that because it has helped us. Here's an example of an evolutionary argument. Correctly following what the other person is pointing as very leads to greater sustenance.
Yeah.
Fit whatever you want to fit regarding fitment,
Yeah.
right? Why do we think that that is good? Why do we think that this is something that the species should follow? Now it seems that over here, the normative concern comes from the back door.
Yeah.
So you can't give, or some have argued, a purely descriptive answer to something like why is this correct? There is this is probably articulated very cogently by Moore when he's trying to say why we can't have a purely natural explanation for good.
Of course.
So I mean that is a token. I mean an example of such a value, but knowledge or correct or incorrect, these are also similar kind of values.
I think there was another philosopher who quoted, "Nothing in what is can ever tell us what ought to be," or something like that.
Right.
Might
Yeah.
have been Moore.
That's
Yeah.
That's Hume.
Yeah. People have spoken about the fact value distinction in different ways, but
Yeah.
I have a question regarding like this concern with meaning in the first place. So what it seems to me, I'm sorry if I'm like cutting in other questions, but it seems to me what is one of the things that is at the center of the debate is that linguistic, in order for linguistic community to sustain itself, we need to make sense of what each other, and kind of it follows obviously. Right? If we don't make sense of what the other person is saying, then the linguistic community is not going to sustain itself. In order to explain why we or how we do that, we make use of this term called meaning. And then we want to say that meaning, a particular expression gets meaning because it conforms to a certain rule behavior. This is putting a layer of complexity which is not needed. Instead of saying that a statement has meaning, we simply say that a statement is meaningful. So meaning does not become a property of statements as such, or things, or expressions, but whether or not a particular act of communication is successful. So will that not just dissolve the problem, as it were? And I mean, what would you say that Wittgenstein would have to say? Because I mean, this would be an application of how, I mean, what Quine does in trying to say that we don't need to talk about meaning because we don't think that there is anything called meaning, right? That applies to these things like sentences. So I was wondering if Brandom has considered a Quinean position, or other participants in this debate have considered that, okay, maybe this is not a debate to begin with because there is nothing called meaning.
No, I'm not sure whether Brandom has considered Quinean's approach. Now, usually Brandom also takes meaning as something normative. It has to be normative, whether it is correct or incorrect. So any kind of linguistic expressions that one makes, it has to be a normative way, a one, right? So this normative practices is done, and it is kind of shown back to us by the community. If I am doing something wrong, then they would say that it is wrong, something right, it is correct. But to understand that particular idea, Brandom says we have to go back before language to understand correct normative vocabulary, things like correct, incorrect. We have to go before language. Only then we can come and say that when I'm using this particular expression, it is meaningful. When I'm not using this particular expression, it is not meaningful.
Okay.
Hmm?
I mean, so right. I mean, but why would we need to talk about meaning then, if we can talk about meaningfulness? In the sense that why posit a category called meaning, a property of sentences? This has meaning. Why say that in the first place? Because if we can explain linguistic behavior without that, without saying that terms have meaning, we simply say that in the whole context of how we use language, this leads to successful exchange or conversation, then why posit meaning in the first place? But I guess most of them reject Quinean views then. If they think that there is something called meaning, then they're probably not taking Quine seriously.
Yeah. So, meaning is taken as like this. No? So, when we say something is meaningful, then the normative implication comes, right? The correctness or incorrectness
Right.
or whether that particular expression that you are saying is, whether say it is meaningful, then that, but the normative step implication is always there.
Right.
Now, but the problem is with this normative implication, from where is it coming from and how do we know?
Okay, so
It has
even if you deny meaning, you have to still explain the normative aspect of whatever rule.
Yes,
okay,
yes,
okay,
the
okay.
normative implication is prior to meaning.
Okay, 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 okay. So okay. So even if you don't accept that there are things called meaning, right. The
So
problem
it-
still remains.
Yes, the problem remains.
I think Abhishek sir's point that he raised, I think, even it's mentioned in philosophical investigations, if I'm not wrong, because Wittgenstein uses this example of a surgeon at the table just saying scalpel. So the word scalpel has a meaning, sure, but there in that surgery room, the moment he says scalpel, the scalpel is not a noun; it's actually an order, and the nurse has to hand the scalpel over to him. So it's the action that the utterance of the word actually leads to. That it's in the doing that the meaning is created. There is no
Yes,
inherent.
it's in the use
Yeah, it's in
that
the
the
use.
meaning is created, yes.
So the word scalpel in itself doesn't really mean anything other than the
Yes,
order. Give me the scalpel.
yes. And depending on context, it may also change the meaning. So that is okay. But the normativity, the concept of normativity, that which comes when someone says scalpel, how am I quickly able to understand that this doctor is saying like that? That comes before
That is still-
language or meaning. That is the point I'm trying to highlight.
I come from the discipline of sociology, so I don't know how far I have understood the.
It's okay, I'm also still very confused.
Yeah, so one of the things that I want to ask is, see, so when we talk in sociology of law or legal pluralism, for instance, talk about the legal language and also about the grammar of customary practices. Okay, and then because in the legal language, because there's this normativity or the meaning is often very explicit, we readily know what is they ought to, right? But sometimes when you have to translate this sort of customary practices into a legal rational language, how do you understand normativity in it? And sometimes the anthropologist makes this argument that you have to know the grammar of the customary practices to know the normativity that is implicit in a certain culture or people who follow that customs, right? That grammar needs to be known through embedding yourself in that culture or through inquiries or whatever. So, in from whatever I have understood, this normativity as pre-language or like that it was beyond language. Is this a better way to inquire it, because to understand the grammar of customary practices? Will it be a better way to understand the normativity that is implicit in it? Does that, how do you see the possibility of such an anthropological ethnographic inquiry to understand that implicit normativity in cultures?
So I agree with what you are trying to say. Now, but does that really resolve the debate? Because then can we say that it is something implicit only? Or I don't know how that particular debate can be resolved.
Yeah, I'm talking from purely anthropological sort of lens, but does that help in this debate at all?
Yeah. So, yeah, for sure, why not? So, once we get encultured in a society, then the way that the expressions are used, meanings are being considered, taken as true or false, those things, it is there in the society, in the culture, in the society. That is, taken for granted. But the problem in the debate which comes is, but how is it that you know that you are following one particular rule? Right? Now, one may point to behaviors, one may point to, say, we are following explicit rules, this is the debate. But in order to resolve this, Brandon also says that, so this debate is actually not yet resolved. So in the scholarship, we still have many views still arguing about it. But Brandon gives a kind of a new interpretation, new way of looking at this particular debate. So, of course, Brandon is also still very much criticized into it, but his view seems to, according to me, seems to kind of bridge both the reductionist and kind of the anti-reductionist view together. And as you were saying, yes, maybe culture and language are accepted, but the main idea is the normative attitude that one has, that has to be there before language develops. Otherwise, one cannot really know how, if I don't have that normative attitude of something is correct or incorrect, even if someone teaches me linguistic rules, I will not be able to do it. So this is what Brandon is trying to resolve.
Does Brandon have anything to say from where this attitude comes? I mean, does he have any explanation for this attitude, where it comes from?
It is just, he says it is just a part, inference. It's part of, so we infer as even as prototype hominoids before language came also, we have this attitude of inference, right?
Okay.
No,
Learning,
but
broadly speaking.
he is criticized as like he is also
Yeah, reductionist.
reducing himself. Yes,
Yeah.
yes, he is criticized.
Because
there.
this seems. Yes, please.
Sir, actually, I would give the point Donald's theory, culture, philosophy, even sociology also. So, how this concept is particularly connected to culture first of all?
So my intention with this one is I'm trying to make a comparative kind of connection between Brandon and Donald. So now when we imagine a proto-humanite society without language, any kind of linguistic practices, what is without language, then what is the next thing that we can imagine? If there's no language, then there must have been some sort of culture.
Is different from these fields.
That I'm not aware of. So, but yeah. So, so yes, I'm not aware of that concept of mimesis in psychology. But so I don't know how to relate to that. So here I'm just trying to relate it to the development of language, how language gets developed. But before that, I'm trying to say that before that, that particular culture has to be. So rule following can neither be implicit or explicit. In that sense, it can be neutral. So yeah.
Thank you.
I was just wondering if does this in any way preclude the possibility of rule making between two linguistically advanced communities coming together? Because if there has to be shared culture, if a culture comes prior to language, and it is from there the rules, then if you have two advanced linguistic communities comes together and we deliberate upon what the rules ought to be, does that in any way contradict this, or does it preclude the possibility? Does it preclude the possibility? I might be a bit over the top.
See, that might be problematic in the sense, for example, when we make commitments, for example, we say, I promise not to lie. But in certain contexts, for example, sometimes we tell a white lie to a child. So it does not mean that the meaning or the rule is like we are not following it. But we can make that particular distinction because prior to that we have normative understanding of what has to be correct, what has to be incorrect. So that prior understanding is there. Hence, we can come and make any kind of meaningful expression, different kind of expressions. Different kind of cultures can give different kind of linguistic practices or meanings.
Okay. If there are no other questions, yeah.
Yeah. So thank you so much, and I would appreciate if you can kindly mail me some of your questions and discussions.